Okay, last speaker of today, Kerry McKenzie from the University of San Diego. Delusions of a final theory, Ontic Structuralism without the fiction of fundamentality. Kerry, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Fred. I was a postdoc here like 7 years ago for a project, like 3 months or something like that, and I had an absolute wonderful time. And it's really lovely to be back. I'd like to thank Fred for the opportunity. So, I'm going to be talking today about structuralist metaphysics in particular, how it is currently kind of presented and understood, and maybe starting to think about perhaps other ways that structuralist metaphysics could conceive of itself. And I'm going to do that within the context, of the larger context of the kind of structuralist program in the philosophy of science. So as I think of it, there are kind of 3 core pillars to this program. First of all, there's the kind of the epistemic pillar, epistemic structural realism. So this is a thesis, a claim about what we can know about the world, what we can know about the world through science, right, through the lens of scientific theories. And as I'm sure you all know, this is primarily motivated, at least in its modern guise, by the problem of trying to secure progress through kind of radical theory change, the world stuff. Adding to that, we have a metaphysical pillar called Ontic Structuralism. This is a metaphysical thesis about what's ontologically fundamental, namely structure. Primarily, this is motivated by reflection on our best contemporary physics, general relativity, the boson, entanglement of quantum mechanics, high energy considerations in particle physics, quantum field theory, and so on. Now, adding to this, I would also include a kind of metaphysical or methodological pillar. And this is, I mean, in some sense, this isn't official doctrine, it doesn't have the acronym and so on. But this has been present in structuralism really since the very, very beginning. By its beginnings, I mean the kind of neo-Kantian sort of heritage in Cassirer and Eddington and Russell, Carnap. And this is a kind of naturalistic injunction, right? It's the thesis that metaphysics has to be informed by the relevant science if it is to have any value, right? That metaphysics, if it's to be any good, cannot be done by sitting in your armchair, rolling your eyes back in your head, and proclaiming how the world is on that basis. No, it has to be done with by means of serious engagement with real science. Okay? So hopefully all of these are commitments that you can recognize as very, very important to structuralism as currently understood. Problem is that these 3 theses are in a kind of a rather obvious tension once we remember a certain inconvenient truth, namely that we do not yet possess a final theory of physics. Okay, so we have things like our most fundamental theories just now, things like general relativity, things like the standard model or quantum field theories as the framework in which that is understood. But we don't think that either of these are truly fundamental theories, in part because they are incompatible with one another in various respects. And this fact that we don't have a fundamental theory of physics generates a pretty obvious problem for this position and its 3 pillars considered together. And this is that it's kind of pretty obvious. The problem is that the metaphysical aspect of Ontic Structuralism is this claim about what is fundamental. But the metametaphysical or methodological aspect of structuralism is telling you that when you're making claims about something, then that has to be informed by the relevant science. And we don't have a science that we think of as truly describing the fundamental portions of reality. And indeed, the whole motivation for structuralism, epistemic structuralism, is that your picture of the world changes much as you transition from less to more fundamental theories. Right, and so, thinking about the classic examples of these kind of transitions that have inspired epistemic structuralism, necessitated some kind of realist defensive moves, Think about, the transition from the luminiferous ether to the classical electromagnetic fields, right? These involve changes that we are apt to regard as metaphysical, right? These are very different beasts from a metaphysical point of view. It seems similarly going from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, you have a whole slew of changes in the way that you see the world and how it functions that you're apt to call metaphysical with respect to things like humanism, with respect to things like holism, with respect to things like determinism, right? Similarly to the transitions from free to relativistic physics. So here's the problem, right? How do we, in what sense are Ontic Structuralists who want to make a claim about what's fundamental, namely structure, how are they in a position to make these kind of claims at a time when we don't have the theory, the scientific theory that it seems is so obviously needed for us to be able to make these claims, if these claims are going to be taken to sort of represent the world, which as kind of realists, and including realism physically, we hope that they do. So this is just a massive problem, and actually I think a very under-theorized problem in philosophy of physics in general. Philosophy of physics is shot through, not just in structuralism, but all over the place with claims about what is fundamental, and everybody faces this same problem. It's just that it seems kind of extra hypocritical in the context of structuralism not to have something to say about this or to face this kind of challenge head on. There's very few places in the literature where it is reflected on, conceded even. The most careful, actually, rumination on this is actually in James's book, Everything Must Go. In a kind of portion of the book that hasn't received very much attention is actually the only place I've noticed that it is sort of discussed at any length is a 2010 paper by Van Frassen in Analysis. It's a kind of conversation between Van Frassen and James to some extent, as I remember it. It's called Structuralism, Some Common Problems between Empiricists and Realists. So he talks about this, this section. But in this section, so this comes after James and his motley crew have co-collaborators have kind of served up the dirt to analytic metaphysicians, and then they say, look, we're not perfect either. Nevertheless, we think we're in a better boat than those guys. And this is what they say. One consequence of naturalism that cannot be avoided is that if our current scientific image of the world changes much, as we suppose it will, then it will turn out that the best current metaphysics is substantially wrong. Neither we nor anyone else can do better than articulate the best metaphysical picture the current evidence suggests in attempting to sketch the image of the world that science presents to us now. Note that to the extent that metaphysics is closely motivated by science, we should expect to make progress in metaphysics if and only if we can expect to make progress in science. In chapter 2, which is going to be their defense of epistemic structuralism, we indicate at length why we hold fallibilism about science to be compatible with optimism about epistemic progress in science. This argument carries directly over to scientifically motivated metaphysics. Okay? So that's kind of that's the point. They concede that they're developing a metaphysics on the basis of current science. That current science is going to be kind of overthrown in some sense, but they claim that science can be regarded as making progress, right? So they have some kind of realist story to be told there. And the implication here seems to be, and of course if I'm really misinterpreting this, and we can discuss that, but the implication seems to be that since this metaphysics that they're producing on the basis of current science is so closely wedded to that science, is so closely integrated and informed by that science, then given that the science is making progress, there's just every reason to think that the metaphysics that's so closely based on it can be thought of as making progress too. Right? So this means that our metaphysical claims, yes, they're probably wrong in many respects, but they're better than they used to be. They're making progress, and that confers a certain amount of value onto our activities today. That seems to be the picture. And as I say, they scattered just a few places in the literature. You can find other people making similar sorts of claims, despite some of listed up here. Okay, so that is a rather appealing picture. Right? It's one in which the sciences and metaphysics of science are kind of marching in lockstep with one another. But as I want to argue today, is that this rather attractive, this kind of tempting picture, is likely, I think, is wrong. At the very least, it's not an easy picture to make for me to make sense of. And the reason at bottom is quite simple. The reason is that science progresses, we always think, by creating theories that are successively better approximations to the truth. Right? That is how realists think of scientific progress. However, I would argue that metaphysical claims cannot meaningfully be regarded as approximately true. This is just not a useful way to think, a kind of meaningful way of appellation to make of metaphysical claims. In virtue of the nature of the claims that metaphysicians make and the concepts that metaphysicians employ to make them. They're just not concepts that happily admit of approximation. So after Quine, we've been sort of encouraged to sort of think about the way that metaphysics and science as continuous with one another, as sort of a piece with one another. Indeed we have a sort of working definition of naturalized metaphysics. It's metaphysics that's kind of continuous with science. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, as long as we conceive of it in the epistemology of metaphysics, how it is that you actually come up with a metaphysical claim, how it is that you justify it. However, I think constant sort of emphasis on these analogies between scientific and metaphysical claim, between science and metaphysics that have come in the wake of Quine, has obscured certain really crucial theoretical disanalogies between the two sorts of theorizing. And when I say theoretical disanalogies, I mean differences with regard to the nature of the claims that they make and the concepts they employ. Okay. So, what's going to follow, all that's really going to follow, if this is right, and you might argue that this is not right, in fact, probably some of my argument is a little bit Procrustean, and I invite you to find counterexamples to the way that I say metaphysical claims are, the way that they work, the language that they employ. But if what I'm saying, if there's truth in that, then all that's really going to follow is that you can't infer that metaphysics is making progress from the fact that science is making progress too. Simply because the different notions are involved, and there's no kind of analogical, kind of deductive inference to make from one to the other. However, I actually think the situation is a little bit, one can make a stronger claim, but I probably won't make that today. Nevertheless, these considerations that I'm going to kind of present you with today, I think raise, at least have got me thinking about a bunch of metaphysical questions about metaphysics. Questions such as the following: does, you might call big M metaphysics, have to centrally be about the fundamental? So here I'm employing terminology from Anjan, so we talk about small m and big M metaphysics. There are some metaphysical projects, small m metaphysical projects, that are untouched really by these kind of considerations. Small m metaphysical projects are just a kind of Quinean project of just kind of saying what there is in a scientific theory, saying there are maybe electrons and there are charges and so on and so forth, without really getting into kind of metaphysical interpretation too much about what these things are. Big M metaphysics, on the other hand, is things like what are the nature of properties, is there fundamental modality, is the world holistic, and so on and so forth. Does big M metaphysics in that sense have to centrally be about the fundamental? So I could give you plenty of quotes of Breaking the Good in Metaphysics, Jonathan Schaffer, Ted Sider, David Chalmers, saying that metaphysics is definitionally about the fundamental and perhaps the grounding relation that it bears to the non-fundamental. It's just a very fashionable way to think about metaphysics. Not just fashionable, it's not necessarily just a new thing. So I think these considerations will make us think about that. Because it's the fact that we're trying to get at what's fundamental that's causing all the problems here. Nevertheless, if my argument's right, we can't make progress, right, before we have a fundamental theory. So that assumes that actually metaphysics is this kind of end-time thing. It's got to be. It's not clear what work there is to be done beforehand. So assuming that maybe that metaphysics, big M metaphysics, has to be essentially about the fundamental, can you make metaphysical claims with some hope of being true or approximately true in advance of a fundamental theory, perhaps by reforming metaphysical language or something like that? So here the question is whether we can make, in metaphysics, moves that are analogous to those that epistemic structuralism makes in the context of science context of scientific theories to kind of future-proof those theories. What would a future-proof metaphysics look like? And that's a question we have to think about in the wake of these considerations. And if it turns out you can't, that well, there's nothing useful you can do before you have a fundamental theory in metaphysics, what is the value of metaphysical argumentation in advance of a fundamental theory? What is the value of the project that we engage in just now? There might be lots of value there, but perhaps it's non-cognitive value. Perhaps it's kind of heuristics to help physicists design theories or something like that. But these are questions that are going to be raised. Now, I've written about most of this in a paper, The Philosopher's Stone, Physics, Metaphysics, and the Value of Fundamental Theory, if you want to read about this. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm very quickly going to talk about progress in science and how we understand it. Then I'm going to talk about Ontic Structuralism as a fundamentality thesis. And then I'm going to talk about why it's hard for the notions of progress that apply in science to apply in metaphysical domains like that. So, I'm not going to say much about progress in science because I'm kind of just taking it as a given as an audience like this that most of us is going to be highly familiar. Epistemic progress in science, as the quote from James has reminded us, is standardly taken to amount to the production of better approximations to the truth. Okay, so here's a quote by Boyd in 1983: "The historical progress of the mature sciences is largely a matter of successively more accurate approximations to the truth about both observable and unobservable phenomena. Later theories typically build upon the observational and theoretical knowledge embodied in previous theories." Right? That was the kind of somewhat lazy realism that philosophers of science had at the time before the lessons of Van Frassen sunk in. I think it's just before the scientific image had been written, actually, before Larry Loudon's computation of convergent realism. And in the wake of these kind of objections, especially the historical objections, people were then clamoring to defend this position that had been taken to be just obviously the case. People are scrambling to try and find some notion of approximate truth that could still be ascribed to scientific theories despite the radical nature of major theory change. Right? And how radical it is something that was really pressed by Loudon. So what realists are, including structural realists, right, and primarily, well, most obviously structural realists, most relevantly structural realists do, to try to maintain that there is some kind of progress through theory change, is by appealing to the correspondence principle. Okay, so this is sometimes given a kind of descriptive rendering, sometimes given a kind of normative or prescriptive rendering. But it's something like the idea that the central equations of new theories should, and hopefully do, reduce to those of the old theory to a good approximation when the new theory is applied to the systems that were used to empirically confirm the old theory. Okay. So, classic examples here, well, kind of paradigm examples of this is the relationship between the equations, central equations of special relativity, the Lorentz transformation, and the kinematic equations of Galilean relativity. So if you investigate if you study the Lorentz transformations in the limit that velocities become very small in comparison with the speed of light, then you will find that those equations, the gamma factor basically deforms to unity and you get back the Galilean transformations. And of course it's those systems that are moving slow relatively to the speed of light that are going to correspond to things like ships and cannonballs and the sort of relatively quotidian phenomena that was used to confirm Galilean mechanics, Galilean kinematics. And so that kind of takes you to the sorts of systems that were used to confirm the old theory. So other examples of this, famous examples are look at the central equations of non-relativistic quantum mechanics, see what happens to them in sort of pretty short time scales, in sort of pretty ordinary ambient environments. What you will find is things like dust particles will very quickly start behaving to a good approximation to the way that Newton said that they would, insofar as the kind of the peak of their spatial wave function is going to evolve approximately continuously. The eigenvalues of that are going to be very close to one another compared to all other relevant scales of the problem. and the particle is extremely likely to follow a trajectory that is extremely close to Newton's predictions. Right? That's another case of correspondence in action. Now, of course, with structural realists, they put that correspondence, the correspondence between these central equations, these mathematical correspondences, absolutely front and center in their response to the problem of theory change. But pretty much every realist about physics is going to have to do something like this, simply because these equations are so important. Okay, so many things we could say about correspondence. So the correspondence principle. So some people are going to argue. People are going to argue about whether it really is the case that, you know, in almost all cases of theory change, one does find correspondence. You can look at work by Peter Vickers, for example, or Tim Lyons arguing that it's not anywhere near as pervasive as people think it is. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'm also not going to talk about you know, the questions about whether these correspondences are purely formal, right? They're just relations between people in mathematics, or whether relations between things that are out there in the world. Van Prasten thinks one thing, Heinz Pope thinks the other. I'm not going to talk about things like the Newman objection and whether, you know, even if these are descriptions of the structure of the world, whether there's any real content in there. These are all debates that structuralists have engaged in, and I'm sure I don't have to go over. And they're not all, don't have to go over them, and they're not all relevant here. What I do want to point out is a couple of things that are more relevant to my purposes right now. First of all, insofar as you use the correspondence principle to try and secure some notion of progress through theory change, be aware that it's a notion of progress that is going to apply to mathematicalized disciplines only, right? Obviously. So, as Simon Saunders says in his piece, to what physics corresponds, it seems unlikely that similar considerations will apply to any other branch of empirical science or other than physics. And if it's not going to apply to other branches of science, right, you should be, you know, very hesitant to think that something like that is going to apply to something like metaphysics, which is obviously not science at all. Moreover, insofar as you can use correspondence to define a notion of progress, of epistemic progress, it's a sense of progress that confers clear value on physicists' activities today, insofar as the goal of physicists is to understand the fundamental, right? What is fundamental in the world. So just as you can find lots of metaphysicians saying that, you know, they want to understand the fundamental, you can find plenty of high-energy physicists, theoretical physicists saying, yeah, that's what the business of physics is, or at least my branch of physics. It's to describe, hopefully understand, maybe even explain, you know, what's truly fundamental in the world. So to see this, I want to draw out, I think, an important distinction between different kinds of progress. Right? These are two different, importantly different situations that we apply the same term progress to. So I'll give you an analogy to try and get at my point. So suppose I have a particular goal, and that goal is to be in California. And I would say I want to be in California to enjoy certain political protections or something like that, as many people right now do. Coming from San Diego, the whole situation on the border, a lot of people trying to get through. So you can imagine me as I sort of hack my way across the desert to get to the goal of being in California. As I get closer and closer to the border, there's a sense in which I am making progress towards my goal. But if, as is often the case, I get to the border and then I'm told by the border agent, you can go no further, this is it, I'm frustrated at that point, then you know what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, oh God, I got so close, but I'm still so far. Because despite all the progress that I made, ultimately I end up with absolutely nothing. Right? I crossed off a bunch of necessary conditions that I had to, right, to get to my goal. But despite that, unless all of them are fulfilled, I get absolutely nothing in the end. Now contrast that with another goal that I might have. Perhaps my goal is to get all the gold in California. So I walk around California panning for gold, and I go all over the place panning for gold. And at a certain point, I don't know, I get held up by gangsters, I'm told that I can no longer do this anymore, and my efforts are frustrated. At that point, I don't get everything that I want, but insofar as I have some sacks of gold, that has, you know, from the areas of California that I've gone to, I have a piece of what it is that I wanted. Right, so I made progress towards my goal. I didn't get all the way there, but I still have something to show for myself. I got a part of what I wanted. Now these are both situations in which we use the term progress, but they're importantly very, very different. So the progress in the first sense is a kind of monotone, is a kind of threshold affair, right? You make progress towards the end, but unless you get everything, you get nothing at all. Right? Think about the Mars rover that gets like this close to Mars, but doesn't quite make it. It's all or nothing. With the gold case, progress is more kind of monotonic. I'm kind of steadily accumulating what it is that I want, and if I don't get all the way, don't get everything that I want, at least I still get something. Okay? Now, what I want to say is that progress, if the correspondence principle is true, as a kind of descriptive principle about what happens in theories in physics, then the kind of progress that physicists are making is like progress in that monotonic sense, right? They are literally getting part of what they want all the time as they work towards a fundamental theory, because the old theories are literally parts of the theory that they want, ultimately. So lots of people saying such things. Here's Popper. A theory which has been well corroborated can only be superseded by one which contains the old well corroborated theory, at least as a good approximation. Similarly, Higgs Pulse. My claim is not merely that there is an element of continuity and change, which is necessarily the case in all human activity, but that in science, part of the content of the old theory is preserved, as far as one can tell, forever, not just in the next theory, but throughout all future theories. So if correspondence is right, and say when you're producing something like the standard model, this is really well confirmed, you kind of know that what you're looking at when you're looking at this model is an approximation to what the final theory is going to say about those systems. You're actually looking at a little bit of that final theory in some sense. You don't know how small a part of it, you don't know how distinct it is from the whole, right, from the theory sort of taken as a whole, but you've got an approximation to, you've got a little bit of it, or at least an approximation to part of it. So, the correspondence principle furnishes us, it seems, if it's true, with a notion of progress, and moreover a notion of progress in science that confers a very clear sense of value on the activities of contemporary physicists today, insofar as their goal is to understand the fundamental. Even if nobody ever gets there, we've got a little bit of what we want, right, in virtue of these activities. Right, we're building this theory up piece by piece. Now, what I want to claim is that there's nothing obviously analogous to that you can tell about the metaphysics of that science. At least not obviously, there's no such sense of progress that one can find, let alone a sense of progress that confers a clear value on your activities today, insofar as your goal is to understand the fundamental. So this is going to be, I'm going to argue, and I'll get there at the end, a pretty generic feature of canonical big M metaphysics. It's just part of what it is to do metaphysics. You can't have progress in this kind of sense. But structuralist metaphysics is kind of the order of the day, and it's a very good exemplar of this kind of general problem. So, structuralist metaphysics is Ontic Structuralism. At least as we'll talk about, maybe there could be another kind of structuralist metaphysics that is understood today. When you say the metaphysics of structuralism, you're going to get claims like the following. Relational structure is ontologically fundamental and individual objects are not. This is a kind of classic statement of Ontic Structuralism, the metaphysical thesis that goes along with structuralism. So that was from James, I believe from Stephen. Objecthood, according to structuralists, is to be understood as derivative at best, with structure as a fundamental ontological feature. Claims about what is fundamental. So a couple of things to note. It is a claim about categories. It's not a claim about levels. It's a claim about what the fundamental category of the world is. And it's a claim about which categories are more fundamental than others. So, in some sense, even though it's supposed to be sort of radically kind of new in what it says about the world, it's kind of informed by this really kind of exciting science. It has a very different basis. It's a claim about categories than to take the basis that Aristotle was making claims about categories on the basis of. It's nevertheless, it's very continuous with sort of lots of much more traditional kind of metaphysical theses, right? It doesn't get more metaphysical, a claim doesn't get more metaphysical than the claim about what the fundamental categories of the world are, right? The most general genera. This is what Aristotle was all about. And similar, like we've also said, metaphysics today is very much about kind of organizing things in hierarchies of fundamentality. So it kind of ticks all the, although it's supposed to be kind of radical and so on, it ticks all the many of the boxes of a kind of pretty classic metaphysical thesis. In fact, it really kind of reminds me of what William James had to say about the rationalist mind. Okay, so I should say originally my original talk title, I was going to talk about the connections between structuralism and pragmatism. Fred voted it down, didn't want me to talk about pragmatism, so I just think, you know, Templeton Foundation will let you talk about whatever you want at the conference. Fred apparently is willing to censor what the kind of censorship.
Let it go, Kerry.
But in any case, right, so all running through James's work that I found incredibly useful to think about all sorts of things. He contrasts the empiricist mind, right? So the empiricist is the lover of facts in all their crude variety, from the rationalist mind. And the rationalist mind aims to discover the universe's principle, and to possess it is, after a fashion, to possess the universe itself. God, matter, reason, the absolute, energy. One could add here structure, right? These are so many names for this principle. You can rest when you have it. You are at the end of your metaphysical quest, right? So structuralism in this sense is a kind of everything is blah metaphysics, with the blah slightly different from the blahs that other people have defined as being fundamental. Okay, so I just want to point out, you know, structuralist metaphysics is kind of radical, informed by science and so on and so forth, but you know, it's metaphysics and it might be vulnerable to lots of the other problems that metaphysics has. Okay, so it's a claim about categories. It's a category of structure that's ontologically fundamental. What do we mean by structure? So this is something that Jonathan has already brought up. He was kind of objecting to this sort of way of thinking about structure, and maybe in, and I do think I'm definitely as guilty as anybody else in this regard as far as I've written about structuralism. We could all be a little bit clearer, less ambiguous, I think, about what we mean by these categories. What exactly do we mean by objects? What exactly do we mean by properties? What exactly do we mean by structure? Perhaps in the round table we could come back to some of that. However, there's a kind of venerable tradition, at least in structuralism, that considers structure kind of as the following: relations and extrinsic properties. Right? So this might not be the last word on structure. I mean, relations have intrinsic properties, maybe, you know, being tertiary, that sounds like an intrinsic property and so on. But let's work with this. So this kind of, and as such, is contrasted with intrinsic properties. Maybe not just intrinsic properties, but intrinsic properties are most definitely not structural. So this is goes back to Maxwell's paper, I think, coined the term structural realism, where he says structure there is whatever is not intrinsic. Right? This is an idea that's kind of sympathetically discussed by Stephen and James' books. So let's kind of work with that. Now I should say probably intrinsic relations on these grounds should be excluded as well, right? An intrinsic relation is stuff like, you know, having a right side longer than your left, right? That is a relation, but it's also an intrinsic property of the thing that has it. And I think probably these should be excluded also. Presumably what's metaphysically interesting is the things like the intrinsicality, the extrinsicality, not so much the adicity of something. Maybe you think that adicity is really metaphysically important. Anyway, so I bracket that for now. But it seems that what we're going to understand by structure are relations and extrinsic properties, probably excluding intrinsic relations, definitely excluding intrinsic properties. And there's some kind of textual, historical reasons to think about structure that way. So as such, objects are generally construed, the things that structuralists don't think are fundamental. These are entities that have intrinsic natures in some sense, right? So this is a claim we find all over the structuralist literature. Right, so it's all about the rejection of intrinsic natures, at least prior to entering into relations. So there's lots of ambiguities in this too. You know, to have an intrinsic nature, is it sufficient to have one intrinsic property, or does the whole lot have to be intrinsic? Right, you have one property that's not intrinsic, then you depend on something else. So is your essential nature intrinsic? So, bottom line, seems to me, for there to be fundamental on this definition, for there to be fundamentally only structure and not anything else. Object, there cannot be any fundamental intrinsic properties, right? Because intrinsic properties are just not structure. So if you want to have this one category, always blah ontology with structure in the blah place, there cannot be any fundamental intrinsic properties. Okay, now I should be clear, also pretty much all metaphysicians, the only kind of very obvious current example of this, counterexample I can think of is John Heidel. All metaphysicians, pretty much contemporary metaphysicians, sanction relations of, as fundamental entities, right? Spatial-temporal relations, from Lewis at the very least, or entanglement relations. So for structuralism to be a distinctive thesis, it's not enough to have relations as fundamental, you have to have this vanishing of intrinsic stuff. So how do we do that? How do structuralists do that? Well, the way that structuralists do this is, they're kind of naturalists. They look at your best, most fundamental current physics. That's the best you can do, as James has said, so that's what you're going to do. So as I'm sure many of you know, to argue that relations are more fundamental than objects, a lot of work has been done by quantum non-supervenience. This has been used on things like the permutation, and so on. Permutation invariance of quantum mechanics has been used to argue for the ideas that quantum particles don't have intrinsic identity, that they're just individuated entirely parasitically on the nexus of relations in which they stand. So we heard about some of this from Jonathan. Jonathan a little bit. So probably arguments that are very familiar. Fundamentality and so on. As Anjan, so that really dominated this idea that particles don't have intrinsic identity, or space-time points in the case of the whole argument. That really generated a lot of literature in structuralism. Anjan is absolutely right, I think, to point out that that's only, quite explicitly, that's only part of the story. So if you think of objects, the objects of physics, right, you think about like particle kinds, kind of most paradigmatically, electrons and positrons and all the rest of it. When you think about particle kinds or objectual kinds, you think about things of a particular type, electrons, positrons, whatever else, but also particular members of that type, right? To be an object is to be a token of a particular type. The stuff about intrinsic identity, talked about how we distinguish different tokens of the same type from one another. But Anjan's like, that's only part of the story. You also have to give a story about these kind properties. So as he says, it should be the case that not just some, but all essential properties of particles described by quantum theory are extrinsic. But while some properties are described by quantum theory in terms of relations of entanglement, right, that has all the implications for extrinsic identity, others are not, he says. Mass and charge, for example, are state-independent intrinsic properties of subatomic particles, whose attribution thus violates the first condition that all properties are intrinsic. Right? So he used this fact about kind properties to argue that the structuralist claim that there were no intrinsic properties fundamentally just can't be right. So Stephen and I, in our Thinking Outside the Toolbox paper, sort of tried to start an argument that actually these properties are not intrinsic properties after all, by thinking about things like gauge invariance in particle physics. That got some argument got some criticism, so I kind of went back to it and tried to improve it a little bit. Then I published a paper in 2016, looking forward, not back, in which I tried to kind of improve the argument that all the fundamental kind properties are extrinsic. So to really kind of take on Anjan's challenge there. So here's sort of how we did it. So I did what structuralists do. You make a claim about fundamental properties. You want to make it on the basis of a claim about the nature of these properties as a naturalist on the basis of the most fundamental physics or the appropriate physics, which is obviously going to be the most fundamental physics you have. So that is quantum field theory, right, the language of the standard model. Go in there and see what you can find, right, with regards to the kind of metaphysical profile of these properties. And so here's the argument that I made, right, that there's considerations in quantum field theory that suggest that none of these properties are intrinsic. So I said, right, what's a fundamental property in quantum field theory? Well, it's a property of the field that features in a fundamental theory of quantum field theory. So quantum field theory is really a sort of framework for theories, a broad set of axioms that any given theory, right, defined by a Lagrangian, gives a set of fields for the interactions defined between them. So fundamental theories according to quantum field theory are going to be those theories, those sets of fields with an interaction between them that are well defined in the limit of arbitrarily high energy. That's how you think of a fundamental theory within the context of quantum field theory. Why is this? Well, in quantum field theory, spacetime is Minkowskian, it's nice and continuous. There's complementarity from the quantum side between energy and space. So the fact that spatial distances can resolve themselves to arbitrarily small distances implies that the energy space that you have to be filled can get arbitrarily large. Okay, so when you're looking at thinking about what a fundamental theory is in quantum field theory, you're thinking about a theory that stays at the very least nice and well defined in a limit like that. So this is a phenomenon called asymptotic safety. Now, one thing that should be clear sort of right away, that an arbitrary theory is not going to be well defined in a limit like that. Just because an arbitrary piece of mathematics is not well defined as its variables start diverging off to infinity. So what features does a theory have to have in order to be well defined in a limit like that? Well, it turns out that it has to have pretty special combinations of fields, right? And the reason for that is that if you're having familiarity with quantum field theory, the beta function that is describing how this theory, the predictions of this theory change with energy, is kind of a priori a function of the full field content, right? So if the beta function is going to be nice and well behaved, the field content has to be appropriately tuned. So, simplifying a bit, what properties do theories have to have? This is fully general, but an analogous thing my hunches will go for the more general case. So what constraints are there on the field content of a theory if it's going to be well defined in a limit like that? Well, there's a couple of them. One, it's got to have a local gauge symmetry, and hence it's going to feature some gauge bosons in there. Non-abelian gauge bosons more specifically. So that's a well-known feature of a fundamental theory in quantum field theory, but that's not all of it. There are also constraints on how many fields it can contain. In particular, there's constraints on how many fermions it can contain. So, if you don't believe me, this is Sidney Coleman. Theories of non-abelian gauge fields, like local gauge theories, and Fermi multiplets are sometimes asymptotically free and sometimes not. If a theory has too many fermions, the sign of the beta function is reversed and asymptotic freedom is lost. Right, so often one hears that quantum chromodynamics QCD is asymptotically free. It's our first example of a real theory that in some sense is a candidate as a fundamental theory. That's actually not true without qualification. Turns out that if the number of flavors of quark in your theory exceeds 16, the sign of the beta function is reversed and it starts blowing up at high energy. Right? It's like not particularly well known fact. So this is massless QCD. If you put masses in, it's even more complicated. But you can see here the beta function is going to change sign as you get to so 2 number of fermions over 3. So if that's 16 or below, then that's 32 over 3 or less. And so 11 minus that is going to be positive. You add another flavor of fermion of quark into your theory, and the sign of the beta function is reversed, and it starts blowing up. Right, so we are aware of 6 flavors of quarks right now. If we find more than another 10 flavors, then QCD is no longer a candidate for a fundamental theory. So in my papers, this is all a bit rough and ready, but I argued that this gives rise to a kind of Goldilocks principle for fundamental kinds. If you're going to give me a set of fields and tell me that they're fundamental, then there can't be too many of them, but there also can't be too few. And as I would argue that this puts pressure on the idea that the essential properties of fundamental fields are intrinsic. Right? An intrinsic property is one that an object has solely in virtue of how it is, completely independently of its surroundings. Quantum fields, fundamental quantum fields, arguably are not like that. If I tell you I put a field behind my back and it's fundamental, you tell me something about the nature of that field, and I can immediately start making some really sort of non-trivial deductions about what does and doesn't accompany the world alongside that field. Right? And that's what intrinsic properties are supposed to do. Right, now I should say that these restrictions on field content, to my knowledge, right, there might be something analogous. Other constraints, I'm not aware of them. Certainly these restrictions are on fundamental theories only. Right? This is what happens when you ask theory to be well defined in a really high energy limit. There are perfectly good effective theories that only contain fermions, for example, right, and no gauge bosons. So things like the Fermi theory of 4 fermions interacting at a point, that's a perfectly good effective theory. Nuclear physics is full of effective theories that contain, say, only fermions and scalars, like these ones. So if you don't find these constraints anywhere except that it seems at the front of, when you're thinking about what the truly fundamental things are. Okay, so that's a kind of, that looks like a kind of structuralist argument. That's the sort of thing that structuralists do. You mine your best contemporary physics, you see what metaphysical conclusions you can get out of it, and then you publish it in studies, and this is how the industry of structuralism kind of gets done.
Yep.
However, right, there are all sorts of problems with this argument, right? It is really, like I just said here, you don't really find these kind of constraints when you're not asking for these constraints on field content, when you aren't asking for these very demanding mathematical properties of staying consistent in a limit like that. So it's really this limit that does all the work. However, it's in a high energy limit where any theory, right, is the least trustworthy, right? This is, as Porter Williams has pointed out in his paper Scientific Realism Made Effective, this is a really, really bad place to be building metaphysical castles, right? Because the next theory, the correspondence principle doesn't guarantee that you're going to preserve what you think about theories that hold in that limit if you haven't actually tested theories in that limit. And we haven't, and we probably never have. So it never will. So this seems to be a very kind of insecure place to be making metaphysical claims. Indeed, there's some reason to think that there's absolutely no such limit in nature, right? So because of consideration of quantum gravity, maybe space-time is quantized, and that means that there is a kind of limit to how much energy can put into a system as well. So this here kind of evokes the debate between Doreen Fraser and David Wallace about how to do the metaphysics of quantum field theory. Doreen is like, take quantum field theory on its own lights, right, and see, whether it can be made sort of self-consistent and so on. David Wallace is like, no, don't do that, right? Think about quantum field theory in the context of your best sort of meta-science, everything that you know about science. And when you do that, you realize that quantum field theories don't have to be consistent, right, in a limit like this. And I think, on this, David Wallace has got to be right. Doreen is treating this, everything else we know about science is like, we have like a jury that's told, like, don't watch that video on YouTube that was illegally acquired, the police say something about whatever in their hotel room. That's not admissible evidence. We're not in that situation, right? We should use everything that we have to try and build up our metaphysics. So, there's a question, right? I've made an argument, is there any value in it whatsoever? By my own lens, is there any value in making an argument like this? Well, hopefully, maybe. Maybe you can argue that, there's be some truth in the argument that I just gave you. Why is that? Well, think about the kind of the MO, right, in contemporary physics, which is that we treat all current theories as effective theories. At best approximately true, but approximately true for all that. So even QCD is regarded as an effective theory of a more fundamental theory, right? Even though in some sense internally it could be consistent up to arbitrarily high energies, we think that it really isn't. Now, QCD was got at by considerations involving the gauge principle, right? The gauge principle has proved itself to be extremely useful in the domains of quantum field theory that we have tested, right? The kind of domains that the LHC tests on a regular basis. So the gauge principle has proved its worth in low energy to make relatively low energy domains, leading us to quantum dynamics. A lot of my argument against the idea that there's fundamental intrinsic properties has been done by the idea that there's a gauge principle, right? So that when you have fermions, you have to have gauge bosons as well. So, to the correspondence principle, we've got reason to think that something like the gauge principle is going to be preserved in some kind of approximate sense in future physics. Like, it's going to be the case wherever new theory comes along, that in the energy ranges that we've tested, theories have to be kind of approximately gauge invariant, whatever that may mean. It's maybe not obvious what exactly that means, but something like that has to be true. So, metaphysics of the gauge principle seems like a kind of safer or worthwhile kind of project. So perhaps then you think that a metaphysics that's based on the gauge principle, as some parts at least of my argument have been, can be regarded as a kind of effective metaphysics. And metaphysics is an approximately true theory that is itself approximately true. Right, so the argument that I gave you, that I published in studies about how you can use considerations of gauge invariance to generate the idea that there's no fundamental intrinsic properties, perhaps there's truth in this. Okay, so it's just like science. It's not perfect. We don't think that this claim I've made is exactly true because it's not based on science, it's exactly true, right? So it can be a miracle if I didn't get anything wrong, but there's truth in it is approximately true. That's the hope. And that's the picture that I take James and his collaborators to be sort of articulating, something like that. I think it's a picture that a lot of us naturalists have in the back of our minds when we argue about what's fundamental from the perspective of current theories. Okay, so it's this idea that I think doesn't hold up. I can't make any sense of when you look at it a little bit harder. Right? I want to argue there's no notion of effective metaphysics that's analogous to effective physics, at least not as big M metaphysics is canonically understood. This is because canonical metaphysical claims cannot be regarded as approximately true. So this is what I'll argue. What I'm trying to develop now in kind of the successor paper is to argue that the truth value of metaphysical claims, so I would argue that they're simply true or they're simply false, and which one they are is highly sensitive to very, very small perturbations in the underlying physical structure. So that's a paper for another day. Okay, so let's see this. Why can we not think of metaphysical claims as approximately true? Well, consider the core claim of structuralist metaphysics as currently understood. Fundamentally, there are no intrinsic properties. Now, equivalently, you can express this as a claim that fundamentally all properties are extrinsic, insofar as their properties are all extrinsic. And this is because extrinsic properties are standardly defined simply as those that are not intrinsic, right? These are mutually exclusive, jointly complete pairs. So, what do you mean by an approximation to fundamentally all properties are extrinsic? You mean at the fundamental level, presumably, I don't see what other options there are. You mean that approximately all these properties are extrinsic, or the properties are approximately extrinsic? I don't know how else you could make sense of a claim like that. Now, what I claim is that neither of these either make sense or work. So start with approximately all. So to start with the descriptive claim, no critic of structuralism, for whom I have to credit Anjan with I think being the most constructive, is going to buy this. Right? That yeah, I've only got one intrinsic property in my ontology, so I have like an approximately structuralist metaphysics. No, it's not gonna work. Right? Anjan is clear. It should be the case that not just some, but all essential properties of particles described by quantum theory are extrinsic. Not enough that the majority of them, every last one. Similarly, a paper coming out criticizing my 2016 paper, some guy, Philip Berghofer, any of you know this guy? I've never met him. Yeah, his paper just comes out of the blue. It's like, oh, why didn't you email me? We can discuss this, whatever. But, so he says that my paper is wrong. It's wrong, and I think my paper is wrong as well. It's wrong because there's at least one property in the standard model that cannot be regarded as extrinsic. And this is the vacuum expectation value of the Higgs field. Right, and I disagree with that. Have you ever tried to calculate this thing? It's very hard to maintain that it's extrinsic. But here's the point that I'm not interested in that thing just now. What I'm interested in is the logic here, right, the dialectics. To refute Ontic Structuralism, he says, of course, it suffices to identify just one intrinsic property at the most fundamental level. Right? One is enough to kill the thesis. So this is how people understand structuralism. And they do that for good reason. We said that structure is whatever is not intrinsic. So that's how we just agreed rightly or wrongly to think about structure. So if you have even one intrinsic property in there, you have something that is not intrinsic, something that does not belong in the category of structure, and hence you don't have that one category ontology. Metaphysicians tend to care about what categories you have, and they don't care at all about how many members of that category you have. Right? That's somebody else's business. Okay? Metaphysicians could care about qualitative, not quantitative differences. because it's a claim about categories, right? And it's not a claim about how many members there are of these categories. What categories are there at all? You have one thing that is in that category, you have the category. Just in the same way as if you had, 10 to the 24 things of that category, you have the category. Okay, so that doesn't work. Can we say that the properties are approximately extrinsic? So, okay, using some very inept philosophy of language, I claim that when we say x is approximately phi, we mean x is at best approximately phi, so not phi strictly speaking. Maybe that's not true in general, but it's going to be true here. Maybe you think in general it would just be like a violation of sort of norms of maximal specificity or something. If you know that the train arrives at exactly 11 minutes past 12, which is the kind of thing that happens in Holland, but in terms of then you wouldn't say it arrives approximately. No, it's going to arrive at 11 minutes past 12. But here, given that we do think that we're going to be wrong about the details, when you say that something's approximately phi, what you're saying is it's around there, but almost certainly not exactly that. Okay. So it follows from this, if you were to say, I think that something is approximately extrinsic, what I'm committing to is this idea that it's not extrinsic, strictly speaking. Right? It's not extrinsic. It's kind of close to it, but it's not that. But if it's not extrinsic, then boom, automatically it's intrinsic. Because the way that standardly these properties are defined, they're defined in mutually exclusive and jointly complete pairs. Right? To be an intrinsic property is to be completely independent of whatever else exists. It doesn't matter if you depend only on an object that's very close to you or very similar to you or something like that. If you depend on something, or a very small object or something like that, if you depend on anything else, your properties are not intrinsic. The relevant property is not intrinsic. So this, I would say, is a kind of rather generic phenomenon of metaphysics. The properties that we use to make metaphysical predications are rather canonically, or certainly paradigmatically, defined in mutually exclusive and jointly complete pairs. Subjective, objective, abstract and concrete, intrinsic, extrinsic, and so on and so forth. Presumably this is how Kant was able to present the history of metaphysics as a history of antinomies. A lot of people took the problem to be that we can't decide which of these antinomies is right. Is there a fundamental level or not? Is this thing reduced or not? Are all of its properties supervenient or not? These are the kind of claims that metaphysicians are interested in. To me, what's really causing the problem in theory change is not that we can't decide which one of these dichotomies is right. If you're a naturalist, you think, no, you should use science to determine which one of these things is right. The problem is that their metaphysical claims are in this really, really clunky language that is not amenable to notions of approximation that mean that you can't make true claims in metaphysics before you have a final theory. Now, presumably, this feature, the clunky nature of metaphysical categories, comes from the fact that metaphysics is supposed to be the most general description of the world there is. It's supposed to operate at the highest level of generality. Now, if I want to make a predication with meaning, it has to have a contrast class, right? And if I want to make the most general predications that I can make with meanings, I'm going to kind of carve conceptual space into two. This is why metaphysics has this kind of clunky, dichotomous character. Okay, so you can see this sort of all over the place. I'll just give you one quote from, once you get, like me, in the kind of grip of an ideology, you start seeing this everywhere. Here's Barry Lower talking about Humeanism. Contemporary Humeans hold that the totality of the world consists of a mosaic of fundamental categorical properties. Categorical properties are properties whose instantiations in a region of space-time doesn't necessitate anything about property instantiations in wholly distinct regions. If it's partially the same, any overlap, then that's in a different category. Wholly distinct regions is what's important. Humeans claim there's no fundamental necessity in nature connecting spatio-temporally non-overlapping events and non-overlapping portions of space-time. In contrast, non-Humeans think that there is fundamental necessity in nature, right? Some non-Humeans hold that nomological necessity resides in fundamental properties themselves. They thus deny that all fundamental properties are intrinsic. At least some fundamental properties are claimed to be such that it follows from their natures, that if one is instantiated in a region, some other property is instantiated in some other region. So you can say the same thing here, right? Can you approximate the claim fundamentally all properties are categorical? Well, try the same game. Try approximately all, or some of them are approximately, or the properties are approximately categorical. If you say that approximately all properties are categorical, what you say is, well, we have one or two. Right, and it's just a couple of non-categorical properties. What are non-categorical properties? Well, as standardly understood, these are the essentially dispositional properties. Right? Again, standardly defined in mutually exclusive joint and complete pairs. Right? Use Alexander Word, expert on all things essentially dispositional. To say that a property is the categorical is to deny that it's essentially dispositional. What's an essentially dispositional property? Well, it's a property, some people disagree with this, but standardly it's understood as a property that's defined in this way. You have this necessitation operator here. You stimulate the thing, then you have this subjunctive conditional, then it would manifest in a certain way. Point is that you have primitive modality involved. You've got a box operator involved in the definition of this thing. Hence, if you have just one non-categorical property, you have this guy in your fundamental ideology, and you're not Humean anymore, because that's exactly what you don't have if you're Humean, namely primitive modality. Can you say then, well, how about we say the properties are approximately categorical? Well, again, as standardly understood, this doesn't make sense. Approximately categorical means it's the opposite. It's essentially dispositional. Right? So, go back to James on the rational mind and its monistic tendencies. He says, the theory of the absolute, right, that's the kind of the oneness, the all is blah. The theory of the absolute in particular has had to be an article of faith affirmed dogmatically and exclusively. The slightest suspicion of pluralism, the minutest wiggle of independence in any one of its parts would ruin it. Absolute unity brooks no degrees. As well you might claim absolute purity for a glass of water because it contains for a single colored germ. Right? So this is, for me, a characteristic of metaphysics. The claims, it spoils to the victor. Right? Your claims are true or they're false and there's nothing in between. Right? Unless it's absolutely perfect, you concede everything. So, metaphysics is not like science, right, in this regard. Metaphysics, science can make progress because it's invented a language in which you can say, look, this is the claim I made, it's kind of wrong, but it's kind of true, right? There's truth in it, right? All is not lost, right? When a new theory comes along to replace it. Right? You still have a part of what you had before, right, as you undergo these transitions. I can't make any sense of an analogous notion like that in metaphysics. So these, again, and structuralist metaphysics, for all that it's informed by science and likes to have a lot of scientific credentials, insofar as it makes an all is black claim of this sort, it's vulnerable to exactly the same kind of objections that could be made to any other canonical metaphysical claim in the face of theory change, right? And I think that's a problem. So here's the questions we started with, right, that my own work is beginning to grapple with more explicitly. Does big M metaphysics have to centrally be about the fundamental? Well, there's a sense in which if we keep our idea of metaphysics, the concepts we use, the nature of the claims we make the same, then it does, because you can't make progress. You've got to wait for a fundamental theory before you can do metaphysics, because there's nothing you're saying is true, right, in any obvious sense before that point. Unfortunately, also is that it means that there's no metaphysics for us to do. On the other hand, maybe you think that's not right. Perhaps we can reimagine what it is, like what sort of claims we want to make in metaphysics. Or how we might come up with strategies of making even bigger metaphysical claims in advance of a fundamental theory that we can defend as likely to be carried over in some sense. Maybe we can come up with better inductive arguments, right, for metaphysical claims. Maybe there's other kind of inductive or strategies that we can use for kind of making a claim on the basis of our current physics that we think can have some kind of after image in a theory that comes afterwards. But if we can't do any of that, well, what is the value of metaphysical argumentation in advance of a fundamental theory? Even Van Frassen thinks there's value in metaphysics, right? It's fun, it might help to illuminate the theory, it helps you think, it helps stave off dementia, just like, crosswords and so on. There's all sorts of different kinds of value that you have in any kind of intellectual project that needn't, require the project to have this kind of cognitive nature that's understood to be describing the world and to have no other kind of value. So, these are the questions I'm leaving with. Thank you very
much. Okay, before we begin, we are going to end at 5:10. Okay. So so that we are in time for the conference drinks. This means, well, you can, so if you're not allowed to ask your question now, remember we have a round table at the end of the conference, lots of time there. You can also approach Kerry personally. She's very approachable. I only want to hear now urgent questions. James.
Thank you very much, Kerry. So, I think things look a bit different if you put this Ontic Structuralist view negatively. Right?
Okay.
So, and suppose you say the Ontic Structuralist view is that relational structure is not reducible. Now, I mean, so sometimes when you say fundamental, one reading of that is, you know, absolutely the bottom rock, bedrock thing. But another way of taking fundamental is like, oh, not reducible, not eliminable, right? So if I say Ontic Structuralism is the view that relational structure is not eliminable, or in general, or not reducible in general, then that isn't refuted by finding something that isn't, you know, that's intrinsic. Because the claim now is, no, but not everything's like that, right? So I think, you know, if you go back to the time when we were originally sort of pioneering structural realism,
Yeah.
we were arguing against people who thought that all there was self-subsistent objects with intrinsic properties. And so, as I put it in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Ontic Structuralism is any view that inflates the ontological priority of relations and structure over individuals and intrinsic properties. So I think it's not quite right to say it's kind of all or nothing if you take the negative thesis, because I think we can be fairly confident that we're going to have room in our metaphysics for irreducible relational structure, even if we think there might also be some stuff that's intrinsic.
Right. Fine, but so this is a good opportunity for me to ask both of you, like, sorry, I mean Stephen and Jane. So, it seems like I've been trying, in terms of contemporary metaphysics, other than John Hyle, who's like, I don't believe there's any fundamental relation. I mean, most contemporary metaphysicians are in the kind of the spirit, working in the kind of the spirit of Lewis. But yeah, spatial, and it's an interesting question how this happens. And I think one of Hyle's points in his book is that relations used to be viewed in terms of, like, in the scholastic era, it's these unbelievably, especially non-intrinsic relations, it's this really, really metaphysically problematic thing, and then people just kind of go over them, and like with Quine, you just don't really worry about them too much. Insofar as structuralism is a thesis, oh, there are some fundamental relations, and there might be other stuff, then nobody, I just can't think of any, other than Hyle, who's going to dispute that.
But that's because we've persuaded people partly, right? Things have changed. I mean, it's certainly true that, I mean, anyway, I'll give you another example, Peter Simons, right? He's another person, and also Jonathan to some extent, right? So, and I don't think it's a straw person position to say there are people who say there aren't any fundamental relations.
Oh, right, no, I don't think it's a straw person.
So one positive aspect of Ontic Structuralism is saying there are fundamental relations, or there are relations that aren't reducible, or something like that. And that's, I think that's non-trivial, and but nonetheless correct. But you know, this is one of those things where, you know, first everyone says you're crazy, and then they say it's interesting, and then they say it's all along, right? You know, way back, I mean, you know, when we first went around saying there could be non-supervenient relations, people were like, no way, there just can't be. Everything must be reducible to properties and individual things.
Did we not think that people took like Russell's sort of refutation of relational space-time kind of pretty seriously? That people thought that it was nigh on impossible to kind of reduce spatial temporal relations to intrinsic properties of material objects.
Yeah, okay, so, and obviously Lewis thinks that there are relations, but only spatial temporal ones, but I mean, the point is to say, no, more than that, right? Not just spatial temporal ones.
Okay.
But anyway, I mean, I think, I would put the emphasis on the falsity of the metaphysical picture that says that everything is made of self-subsistent individuals, and rather than on the... So it's, in other words, it's easier to defend a negative claim than it is a positive one, right? And I think you can still extract a lot from Ontic Structuralism that's correct, negatively put, even if versions of it
Okay,
that
sure,
are put
but
very
that's not
strongly
gonna-
and positively.
Right, but that's not going to be
defensible.
the one category claim.
No, but
All the
I don't
fundamental
believe the
categories.
one category claim.
Okay.
I mean, and if I did, it would be, I would say something like, the notion of real patterns is the best way to understand ontology across the sciences, and it's unified. And it wouldn't be structure, it would be real pattern. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, Stephen.
In a way this perhaps carries on from that, but we put it a slightly different way. How would you respond to someone who presses the point we shouldn't be taking metaphysics to be true in the first place? So what's true, someone might say, is this following claim: electrons have spin half. It's true in the correspondence sense, Tarski, run the Tarski line. And if you now say electrons as bundles of properties, electrons as nodes in the structure, have, in the sense of instantiation, sense of manifestation, spin half, understood as an extrinsic property, you change nothing, right? What's still true is electrons have spin half. So what about that person who says that, well, we shouldn't have expected metaphysics to be approximately true? It's, in a sense, it's getting on to your last question. It's doing something else for us other than contributing to the truth value of the statements that are made.
Oh, I don't know.
Partly because of
What
the
statements were-
Sorry, go on.
Well, it depends on what statements. It doesn't contribute to the truth value in that electrons have spin half, just because they don't make any reference to
Yeah.
intrinsicality or extrinsicality or something like that.
But the property spin, you don't say that property spin, the non-structuralist understands that in an intrinsic way, the structuralist understands it in an extrinsic way.
So this is what I think the small line metaphysics. This is kind of like parroting of kind of science, and then these just people have different
Right.
sort of tastes when it comes to at what sense at what point you're happy that you've understood
Right.
spin.
Jonathan?
Thanks, Kerry. So I wanted to speak to your first lingering question of whether
Yeah.
big M metaphysics has to be centrally about fundamental. Early in the talk, you cited people like myself and Ted as holding a sort of fundamentality first view of metaphysics. And actually, I don't think that's true of me. I think there's a divide among the metaphysicians with people like me and Karen Bennett not on the fundamentality first side, and people like Ted and Jessica Wilson on fundamentality first. My primitive notion is not fundamentality, but grounding, which is a relative notion. What grounds what, the more and the less fundamental. If there is anything absolutely fundamental, it's just the thing that's not grounded in anything deeper. But so you can have, I think, a metaphysics about relative grounding that can operate at higher levels. And of course, it might be ultimately sensitive, because our views about what's going on at the higher levels could be revised, given wild enough to change at the fundamental level. But nevertheless, I think we can be fairly secure in saying things like maybe the moral or maybe even the mental are not fundamental, or the sociological. These features, these are real features of reality, but they disappear below a certain level. So we could still talk about the grounding of, say, psychological properties and
So I think there's
neurochemical
lots of
properties.
questions, lots of questions of those, but so when people think about metaphysics, so often, questions of like, what's your primitive ontology, what's your primitive ideology, right? And it's those kind of questions in particular that I'm focusing on. So I think it's absolutely, so the interesting thing about the example that you gave, surely we can say that mental phenomena isn't fundamental. That's basically, I mean, it's kind of an article of faith, but not just faith. You have lots of inductive evidence for it. And so that is a metaphysical claim, a non-trivial metaphysical claim that is inspired by the history of science. So that kind of gets in the okay side of the ledger. So what I'm ultimately interested in doing is creating a kind of taxonomy of, so some of this work has been done, absolutely. So there's like Elizabeth Barnes and Sally Haslanger and so on, that were like, you and Ted and other people who had all these quotes, we're cherry picking for quotes about metaphysics is all about fundamental. And they were like, well, that just means there's no interesting metaphysics to be done of like society or something like this. So there's also, yeah, so we have a bunch of, there's also your, what's her name? Is it Vetter has been responding
Barbara
to you?
Vetter.
Barbara, yeah, the toolbox stuff.
Yeah.
Where she's been trying to give a taxonomy of projects, that metaphysical projects that you can do without any interesting input from science. I'm interested in all of these taxonomies. What are the interesting metaphysical projects that you can do independently of science and hence not vulnerable to theory change? What are the metaphysical projects that you can do that are that are informed by science but that aren't vulnerable? That you know, whose entire justification doesn't come from these very problematic aspects of contemporary fundamental science. Some of them might be about the fundamental, like this one. Some of them might not be. So really what I'm interested in doing is to try and think about effective metaphysics. What metaphysics can you do before you have a final theory? And so much of it is just going to be like creating these kind of taxonomies of what kind of projects are viable and which ones aren't. But there's a very important set of like Humean metaphysics. That's not obviously to me, that's not a project. Whether you have primitive identity, whether the direction of time is primitive. Any questions about do you have primitive tense operators? Do you have primitive this or that? That predicate is there or it isn't. How do you approximate that? So.
Let's thank Kerry for a wonderful Before we are getting to the drinks, people, there used to be 3 books underneath Aristotle.
Yeah.
Now one has
No, I've got it here. I've just been reading it. I'll put it back. Don't worry, I'll put it back before we go to drink.
I thought none of you are leaving until someone.
What are you doing reading?
Really? It's in the Erasmus video.
Oh yeah.
It's just 2 minutes away.
And
it originally said it was at 6 o'clock.
I thought it was 5:30 finishing at 6. Because from Springer is coming over at 6. And actually, anyone wants to join us, we're going to dinner. Somewhere to go into Rotterdam and have a meal.
I mean, you're really surprised that some change in
I agree with you that there is some irreducible relationships